First and foremost, the drawings, sketches, and portraits in this exhibition exist because Lieutenant Carl H. Holmstrom risked his life to save them. They were his visual record of 28 months as a prisoner of war, or Kriegsgefangenen, aka Kriegi, in Nazi Germany in the years 1943 to 1945. Creating and preserving these works provided Lieutenant Holmstrom with a purpose for surviving his ordeal, and he wasn't about to leave them behind. That they exist at all is a testament to his talent, fortitude, and courage.
My name is John Holmstrom, and I'm best known for creating Punk magazine in 1976, as well as doing artwork for the Ramones. I grew up in Cheshire, Connecticut, and my father was Carl Holmstrom. My father went to art school. He went to Pratt Institute in Brooklyn and majored in calligraphy. He signed up even before Pearl Harbor to join the Army, and he wanted to be a bombardier. So he trained in Texas and went over to the first stage of World War II, which took place in North Africa.
On January 3rd, 1943, he boarded a B-17 Flying Fortress for his first mission, but his career as a bombardier came to an abrupt end when the massive aircraft crash-landed in the Tunisian desert. Though badly injured, Holmstrom survived the crash, but he and his crewmates were captured by the German troops. After being held briefly in solitary confinement, he was sent to a prison hospital at Oflag XXIB in Zubin, Poland for 2 months to recover from his injuries. While recuperating, he began sketching his surroundings, first at the prison hospital, then at the various way stations to which he was transferred, before being moved to his permanent home at Stalag Luft 3. This was a camp specifically for officers in the Air Corps, including British RAF officers, some of whom had been in various prison camps since Dunkirk in May of 1940.
My father was sketching throughout his imprisonment. All the time he was behind barbed wire, he was documenting it. His dream was to publish a book after he hopefully survived the war.
Holmstrom's furtive drawings, portraits, and sketches, created during the many months he was at Stalag Luft 3, offer a rare, authentic glimpse into a world with no cameras, tape recorders, video, or audio. This visual record helps to answer the questions. What were these men like? How did they live day to day? What kept them going?
These men plotted. These men dared. These men lived. The Great Escape.
Stalag Luft 3 also produced a large network of prisoners who have since been immortalized in the book and film The Great Escape, which has only in retrospect added to the historical importance of Holmstrom's work. Nearly 2,000 inmates, mostly British and Canadian, had worked for months to dig 3 tunnels. Only one tunnel made it far enough to allow 76 inmates to scatter into the surrounding forest and then to parts unknown in March of 1944. The escapees carried maps, forged papers, and currency, some of which was produced by Holmstrom.
The great drama, the great entertainment, the great adventure begins with The Great Escape.
I remember when my father took us to see The Great Escape. We were all stunned. I mean, there's this chapter of my father's life, and Donald Pleasance played the head forger, and he looked a lot like my dad. Afterwards, we asked him, what was it like? And he said, oh, it's Hollywood. And I didn't really understand what he meant back then. But then I watched the movie as a grown-up, and I see all the uniforms are nice and clean, people are shaven. In reality, they couldn't wear their boots because they only had that one pair. They'd have to carve out wooden shoes for themselves. Doing the laundry was tough. You know, you'd have to wonder about your future because you didn't know if you were going to live or die. You didn't know what your fate was. It was in the hands of other people, so there's a feeling of helplessness. Some of the men would just give up and stay in bed all day.
Though Stalag Luft 3 may now be best known for the Great Escape, what the film only cursorily depicts is that 50 of the escapees, when recaptured, were summarily executed by the Germans, and only 3 made it to freedom. One of those executed was a Belgian flight lieutenant named Henri A. Picard, who'd captured Holmstrom's likeness in a cartoon that he managed to preserve and bring home safely after the war.
One morning, they were just given, I think, 20 minutes notice to pack up and march out. And it was one of the worst blizzards in that century. It was bitterly cold, snowing like crazy. It became known as the Death March. Many of the prisoners were all moved to a place called Moosburg, which was built to hold 10,000 people, but they crowded it with over 100,000. My father wanted to bring his artwork, you know? He wanted to keep that dream going, but he did lose about a third of the drawings and paintings that he had done. But he carried those in preference to food or water, because it was so important to him to tell the story. I think they were walking 20 miles a day or something in the blizzard. And then they got to some trains and they packed them in like cattle. I mean, people are standing here like this. And the only sanitary facility was a bucket. No wonder he didn't want to talk about his war experience, you know? And they get to Moosburg and bombs are dropping on them and they're getting flak and being killed by their own forces sometimes. And my father, as a result, I think mostly at Moosburg, had developed very severe PTSD. And we didn't know what to call it back then. My mother would just say, "Your father's crazy. Last night he jumped on top of me and started saying that the bombs were dropping. They're bombing us. They're trying to kill us." And she didn't know what to make of it. But this is kind of how he suffered. And one problem I always had understanding his war experience is he didn't talk about it. He didn't talk much about anything. Every time he and his buddies would get together and share war stories, they'd shoo us out of the room. And then in later years, I would research what happened. But it's hard to tell exactly what happened to my father when he was in prison for over 2 years.
Lieutenant Holmstrom's final camp at Moosburg, Germany, was liberated on April 29, 1945, by Patton's Third Army. The imprisonment continued, however, as the inmates were kept there for their own protection on orders from the U.S. military authorities.
They wanted them to stay in the camp, but my father was fed up with being behind barbed wire, so he and a friend escaped from the Americans and hitchhiked all over Europe. And he picked up a lot of souvenirs. So when he got back to the States, he wanted to publish a book. He lived in New York for a while. But all the publishers turned down the book because people were tired of the war. He decided to move back home to Connecticut and self-publish the book. He did about 2,000 copies and mailed them out to a lot of his friends. It was hard for him to make a living because he started a family, he had 4 kids to feed. They came back from the war and they wanted a nice life and they wanted the American dream. And they did everything they could to achieve it. But they left the war, but the war never left them. You know, they were scarred. And as a kid, we didn't understand what was happening and we didn't like it. But looking back, I feel a great deal of sympathy for what he had to go through, and I understand the bravery and the courage that he did show, and maybe that's part of what made me so driven. I knew my father had a dream to be an illustrator and an artist. One of the last times I saw him, he was smiling, grinning from ear to ear, so proud that I had kind of followed in his footsteps, I'm thrilled that the ball and socket art center has been established here in Cheshire. And the fact that my father's being honored here is just the best. My whole family is thrilled. Well, I think the importance of my father's war experience is the desire for freedom. You know, these men were living under a very oppressive tyranny, and the desire to be free is really an important part of being human, I think. One thing the Germans would remark about the Americans was their sense of humor. Even under the harshest conditions, they have fun. They, make fun of things and be lighthearted. And I think that was a strength.